know that the ego fuels, but it also feeds on itself. We know that eventually, when it gets strong enough, it feeds on its host. And at one point you said, your time in the NFL was a showcase of what the ego is capable of when driven by fear. What was the approximate size of your ego when you were at the height of playing in the NFL? And how much of it, looking back on a serious note, was fueled by fear or imposter syndrome?
My ego has always been my best friend and my worst enemy. And I've used it my entire life to get to the places that I wanted to get to until I realized that that ego was no longer serving me. And sometimes certain things had to happen for me to either not get what I want or lose what I currently have to realize that the ego is no longer serving me. But it really wasn't until I began to understand a certain level of consciousness to be able to override the ego, to be able to let go of the ego and kind of go through an awakening of the soul, because the soul has no ego. The soul just is. And so for me, I had to really kind of take a step back into who I really am to be able to understand that the ego was really the enemy.
Bret Lockett is an ex-NFL player who found his second calling as a transformational love coach, and he's on a mission. A spiritual guide and an alchemist, he's now an internationally recognized speaker and relationship expert focused on balancing the yin and yang energies in romantic relationships. He grew up in California, went to UCLA, and then played for the Cleveland Browns, New England Patriots, and New York Jets before retiring in 2013. His career was marked by injuries, setbacks, and like many professional athletes, a refusal to give up. But unlike many others, after his career ended, Bret started searching for a new way to channel his energy and eventually shifted his external search for meaning inward. Nowadays, aside from speaking, coaching, and running an aviation company, Bret is using all of the lessons he has learned about ego, masculinity, and how we can help each other with the traumas we all carry to inform his work with women seeking to transform and receive love. But as he explains on today's podcast, while he works mainly with women, he thinks the root of the problem in modern relationships lies in men. From the deepest caves to the chilliest cold plunges, Bret has done the work most men simply can't or won't do. He's become an expert in gene keys and a seeker of deeper truths about the nature of human consciousness. But lest you think he's Superman, rest assured that he still can't get his siblings on board. But he won't give up on that either, and my money's on him. Today we talk about ego, what it is, how the NFL or any really early success can cause it to metastasize, and what it takes to really reinvent yourself. We explore how he got into breathwork and the role that fear has played in his life. The growing imbalance in relationships isn't all cause for alarm, according to Bret. He describes a powerful experience of awakening to how much pain so many women carry, how much fear men hold in silence, and how he wishes he could teach them to simply hold space for each other. My vote is for him to lead a breathwork, self-love, and vulnerability course as a prerequisite for young men joining the NFL. In case this podcast reaches the folks who can make that happen, on behalf of all women on the planet, as well as all the little boys idolizing these athletes, thank you in advance. It's interesting that you use the phrase, "it no longer served me," right? Because that's a phrase that a lot of women are using now in therapy. Whatever survival mechanisms and tax strategies we had helped us through our teens and 20s and got us into the boardrooms or got us wherever it was we were trying to go, often no longer serve us. So that's interesting. But it's not as if your NFL story was linear. And as I was doing my research, because I like to do my homework, not so much for your benefit, but because I don't want to look like an idiot, it seems like every time you got a shot at something bigger, you got injured, you got cut, you got sneak attacked at one point by a lobster. There was like a piece of and some piece of food in your dinner, and then lo and behold, you have allergies and it flares up and you can barely see or breathe. You got a groin injury, you got metal plates in your body. One league didn't even pay you, right? 4 or 5 games into the season, they weren't even playing you. So this is the other side of professional sports. It's not as if you had an NFL experience that was all sort of champagne and shenanigans, right? I'm sure you had some champagne and some shenanigans, right? This is the family podcast. But, the way you tell the story, it sounds like you have sort of an internal setting that says, keep moving.
Mm.
And from an early age, do you think that kind of agility has any connection to being bullied when you were younger?
When I look back at my life and I look at my trajectory, you're absolutely right. It definitely wasn't linear. However, there was a linear process in my mind, if that makes sense.
Hmm.
So I knew I was going from one destination to the next, and I didn't second guess that. And the reason I never second guessed really anything is because of my upbringing, because of how I was raised through my parents. They taught me at a very young age to believe in myself completely, to never start something I was not going to finish. And those things carried me through the bullying. And bullying was almost the fuel to get me to push even harder. When it came to football, basketball, whatever we were playing, I knew that was my edge because I naturally was gifted in it. And so I knew that was my edge, and that was my quote unquote sense to be able to prove who I really was, the ego, to be able to prove my identity that I'm better than you at this. And at a young age, we all look for something to be great in, right? And I
There
feel
was
like a lot of people, go ahead.
There was a quote, you're making me think of Al Pacino, which is
Yeah.
random, but
Hmm.
I think it was Pacino, and he was very, very bullied when he was younger. And he said, there is no greater fuel in life than I'm going to show them they were wrong about me. I have to tangent for a second.
Hmm.
Um, did you get that moment where you're drafted for the NFL, you're doing your big thing, you're coming back home to visit, and the bully is, I don't know, confronted? Or are
You
you
know,
above it?
this is a thing. All the kids who bullied me, for the most part, were my friends, at a certain level, right? So like middle school, going into high school, I was bullied by all the same kids in middle school, and then when I went to high school, we kind of became friends because we all played sports together. We're on the same team.
Wow.
So it's just kids being kids, boys being boys, I should say. Girls do it too, but it's a little bit different. But boys just being boys and being competitive boys. So I understand it, I get it, but at the same time, it was the reason why I think I was as widely successful in sports as I think I was because of the fact that I had to prove someone wrong. And I had to prove to myself that I actually was could fit in somewhere.
Mm.
And it's funny because I never really felt like I fit in anywhere. I think the Patriots was probably the best place, where I felt like I fit in because everybody was, I mean, obviously we had some great stars on the team and big players. But there was, I think, an element of an ego was somewhat kind of put on an even level just because of the way that Bill Belichick coached. He didn't how good what draft class you came out of. He didn't care what school you came out of. He didn't care about your contract. If you weren't playing to the level that was required to play on the Patriots, you weren't going to play, and that I think made the playing ground even. Whereas a lot of other teams have played favoritism. Oh, I brought this guy in, so I want him to play. It was not anything close to that, on the Patriots. It truly was like um, a system that allowed the best of the best to thrive.
Well, leadership sets the tone, right? And NFL
100%.
coaches are lauded for a reason.
Yep.
Um, I just want to go to your parents for a minute because you talk about them being essentially credited for your resilience, right?
Yep.
Some people get their resilience from overcoming something bad. Other people get it, frankly, from the example of their parents. Was it example or was it active teaching?
I think it was a little bit of both. I mean, my father, whatever he did, there was no second guessing. My father's one of the hardest workers that I know. He actually just retired this Friday, and had his 70th birthday this weekend, which was we had a surprise birthday party for him, which was incredible. And every single person that came up said the same thing: how hardworking he was, how much of a leader he is, how much of a beautiful light he is when he's around people. Like someone said, he's the kind of person that will always make you believe that you can do anything.
That's That says a lot about how, you would become as resilient as you are, but that's not necessarily the case with most people in the NFL, right?
I don't
And
think
I
that's the case with
remember
most people in terms of
most
just,
people generally, but
yeah,
especially with things like the NFL, which can be a proxy for any kind of early success.
right.
I am hyper educated. I went to Harvard. People who come out of Harvard have similar experiences because the idea that you have yet to fail and be humbled at an early age can damage you is something people don't talk about enough, kind of preparing for it. Although I know you also referred to it as not for long, NFL not for long, right?
Yep.
Because
Hmm.
at least you were thinking ahead while you were playing. I have an odd connection to the NFL for someone who knows nothing about professional sports and should never play any sports, professional or otherwise, which is that when I was in business school, I was selected to be a teaching assistant to a program that helped current and former NFL players learn about real estate. And the goal of it, unofficially, was to prevent them from losing all of their money, right?
Most of it.
But the mechanics of it were that some of the best professors at Wharton, where I got my MBA, were sitting down with them and explaining the basics of what to look at when it comes to real estate investment. And I was focused on real estate and I went to real estate private equity and development, all that after business school. But long story a little bit short, I had a room full of about 50 NFL players, current and former. And I was much younger then. And it was a lot of me saying, eyes up here, what's a cap rate? Who can tell me what's a cap rate? So I got to know these guys. I got
Yeah.
to know a handful of them back in the mid 2000s. And so I have some understanding of the challenges that they went through in terms of being parted with their money by trusting the wrong people. And also some of the big challenges of reinvention, right? A lot of those guys really never thought about the world past professional sports. And it may be because their bar was low for what kind of a financial cushion they needed, given perhaps where they came from before they went into the NFL. Maybe this was the biggest opportunity anyone in their family had ever seen. But what didn't get talked about a lot was mental health for professional athletes in general. You could say that professional athletes have trouble with transitions, right? And that they're known for having trouble with transition. You could say there's some biology to it. How did you personally cope with your transition out of the NFL? And what would you do differently knowing what you know now?
When you do something your entire life, it becomes you. And when you do it at such a young age, you don't know anything else except for that version of yourself. And so for most athletes, and particularly football players, when you look at the people who are getting these $100 million contracts, as a child, you look at that and you say, that's going to be me. And so we're all hinging on this idea that we're going to ultimately become that $100 million player. When truth and reality is, it's probably about 1% of the NFL that actually get to that point, right? So
Right.
you have to be on your second contract to even get that deal. And second contract starts 4 years into the NFL. The average NFL player is 3.5 years.
Yeah.
So it becomes this illusion, if you will, that you're actually going to get to that point. So when you were talking about, being in a room full of football players, the idea that I have enough money now isn't really their mindset. It's more about that I'm going to make this amount of money in my career, and so I can spend this kind of money, right? They think it never ends, right? And a lot of it has to do with how they were brought up, their financial literacy, the education surrounding numbers. And in the African American community, that's not prevalent, right? When you look at every other community in the world, Asian, Jewish, Indian,
Right.
they're all centered around understanding money, right? And
Right.
African Americans are not, and so that's usually where you see the wealth gap. To kind of fast forward here to your question, just in terms of understanding my journey and getting out of it, and actually ask me the last two questions again because I jumped around here.
How did you cope with the transition
There we
out of
go.
the
Thank you.
NFL? And what would you do differently knowing what you know now?
We all go through these phases in terms of, I would say, consciousness and understanding. And the level of understanding is based on your level of consciousness. So when I got out of the NFL, I would call myself, or I would say I was at a very low level of understanding of who I was, what life was about. I was holding on to this idea of who I was as a football player that wasn't going to match any part of my life transitioning into the next phase. And so I was just going to look for the answer. And so really after I got done, the last probably 10 years of my life has been trying to understand people, trying to understand why people are happy and why people suffer. And then also figuring out how people cope with not getting to where they wanted to be in life. Right. And that led me down this whole rabbit hole of kind of a spiritual awakening, if you will.
You know, it's interesting you talk about getting to the top of the game, right? And being the person who beats the odds and gets to that big football field and the whole world is watching. I don't think it's the same as comparing the anticlimax of being famous in any other way. I think when you're famous as a singer, when you're famous as a politician, your experience of fame is very singular. You are the only person on stage, and you may have a team of people around you who are telling you what you want to hear, getting you ready, putting your makeup on. But at the end of the day, you're solitary most of the time. So I think when the lights go out, you go back to a world that you always knew was there, that you just weren't participating in, right? If you're Celine Dion and suddenly you're just, nobody's interested in you anymore, it's not like you thought the rest of the world lived like you. It's not like you lived in a different planet. You
Right.
were treated differently on the actual planet that we all live on. I think when you go into professional sports, especially something like the NFL, there is an idea of getting to this next level and being the best, but then you're in a room full of men who are also the best. And then there is this herd mentality, and the champagne is popped higher, and the music is played louder, and the women and the this and the that is endless, right? So it's more than just the experience of being on top, it's the experience of actually living in a completely different world. Why would we think that anticlimax wouldn't be horrendous? Participate in it, right? And I understand some people get married at 20 and don't participate in any of those things. They just go to the field, but the majority of people, I'm saying.
Right. The majority do. And you're right. It is, it is another world. And that world is completely different for each player because some players are on a Tom Brady status while
Right.
other players are on a Bret Lockett status. Right. So
Same, right out here.
it's a huge contrast, right? When I came in, Tom was probably like 10 years in already, maybe, I think, around there.
Yeah.
I played with guys like Randy Moss, Wes Welker. Me and Julian Edelman were the same year coming in. So like he was on the bottom of the totem pole. Now he hangs out with Tom in Turks and Caicos, right?
Yeah.
So that level changes based on how well you play, based on who you end up connecting with. I spent a lot of time in the limelights off the field on red carpets and charity events and this and that. So that took a completely different structure for my life, right? And so as much as it is its own individual world, we still break out into our own, I would say, versions of who we are and compete with that, right? So you're competing with basically your ego at that point, right? How good do you want to be as a football player was Tom's ego, right? I'm not going to lose, right? My ego was based on how much attention I could get, right? Because that's what fed me. That's what gave me satisfaction. That's what made me who I was. And so
Well, and
it was two different parts, I would say, for me. And I'm just giving you an example of Tom,
yeah,
but because everybody knows who he is, but it was
yeah,
different for every single player on the team.
right. I mean, you bring to it whatever you bring to it in the first place. And you mentioned ego. I do want to talk to you about ego death, but first I want to ask you this. How does an NFL player find his way to breath work? And how did it, as you say, help you find your fear?
It's a great question. And I truly want to say that everything that's meant for us will find us eventually. Right. And so breath work was going to find me eventually. And it's funny because how breath work found me was through someone that I met on the Patriots while I was playing there. So Curtis Lee Thomas, who's one of my best friends, is the founder of Breathwork Detox, which is the largest corporate mindfulness company in the country, right? They done breathworks for NASA, Nike, you name it. Okay. And while I was on the Patriots, he used to throw parties for the New England Patriots at Foxwoods casinos in Connecticut. And he had like a liquor company at the time, and I think he had a jewelry company as well. And, you know, I met him through some friends on the Patriots, and we ended up, you know, meeting a couple times. He wanted me to invest in some things I didn't at the time. Okay. I leave New England, you know, we don't talk, lose touch. One of the people that I'd probably never remember. Right. And I moved back to LA after retiring on the Jets, and it's about 2016, and I'm walking through this event, and then I met someone at this birthday party who invited me to this entrepreneurial group in LA called Metal, which was like an all men's group. It's a great group. So I'm walking through there on the first day, and I run into Curtis Thomas, who is a part of this group. And I'm, Curtis, what are you doing? He's like, I just moved here. He's like, I moved here like 3 months ago. I just wrote this book. You know, it's an Amazon bestseller. Long story short, we have coffee afterwards, and me and him are connected at the hip since then, since 2016. And at that time, you know, he was wearing crystals, and, you know, he's this author who's written this book called The World Is Yours, The Secret Behind the Secret. And, you know, it's all about manifestations and the law of attraction. And I'm like, what is this stuff? Right. And so the book piques my interest, but you know, he's a cool guy. We still could go out together. We could still conversate. It wasn't too woo-woo for me. And he slowly fed me, you know, kind of piecemealed me over time to where, you know, he was like, hey, come to this event. I'm going to, you know, it's a breathwork event. I'm like, what's breathwork? And he's like, you just lay on a yoga mat and you breathe. And I'm like, I could do that at home. I was in finance at the time. I'm wearing 3-piece suits every day. I'm like, that's not my thing. So lo and behold, he gets me on a yoga mat. And at that time I was in a relationship. So I brought my ex at the time, and I had one of the most profound experiences I've ever had in my life. And from there, that's when everything kind of opened up.
That night, you have this first breathwork experience of your life. And as you say, you had no template for it. You know, one does not go from the NFL to breathwork.
No.
Did you go home confused? What was your perception?
I definitely wasn't confused. I was awake. I was inundated with these feelings of euphoria, of joy, of happiness, of pure universal love for people and myself. And that wore off very quickly because I live in LA, and you get back on the 10 or the 405 and you're just
2 minutes of traffic, and the world has avowed you of the notion that energy is all it takes. But yeah, that your own
exactly
energy can surpass everything around you.
right. But it was the first step to the next step, which was more breath work, which then led into exploring psychedelics, and which led me down the path of working with psychics and mediums and you name it, to where I just got back from a 2-month kind of hiatus of traveling through South America, visiting Peru, spending about 3 weeks with a shaman down there, and going to Guatemala and seeing every single ancient Mesoamerican site I could see while I was down there, which brought me back to LA to just understand a different way of life, a different way of being, a being that has no expectations, that holds on to really nothing because there's nothing to hold on to. It's just to exist. And I feel like that's the journey, and that's the part of my journey that I want to share with people, because we all are holding on to something that we think we're supposed to be, because at a very young age, we're conditioned to think that we're supposed to become something, when at that age, we're supposed to just understand that we're just simply being and allowing whatever it is to flow through us at that time. And I don't believe we're here to work. I don't believe we're here to, chase material wealth. I truly believe that we're here to awaken each and every one of us to understand that we're all connected. We're no different than the plants and the trees and the bees. And we're just here to really love one another and live life.
I'm on the same page,
Yep.
but it comes from my upbringing. I'm Indian, I'm Hindu, we believe in
Yep.
reincarnation.
Sure.
If you are intellectual about being Hindu, then everything you're saying makes sense to me. But I
Right.
don't run around telling people we're no different than the trees and the bees, right? And the reason I don't say that is because either you understand the concept of energy and souls and how unimportant we are, or you don't. And I don't believe I'm going to convince anyone because I do believe it is the human condition to be born, struggle, mess up a bunch of your relationships, try to heal them, and then die understanding that that was the point, right? It was all just about all the, right? And so I don't think anybody can get you there because we're all being kicked in the head constantly, metaphorically. Some people like you, maybe sometimes physically, but not for normal people like me, right? And as I've been having all these conversations, they keep weaving back to this feeling that everyone is searching. They just may or may not recognize that they are searching for something. And I go back to the NFL with you. There's a lot of toxic masculinity in that environment. Um, what do you think it is that holds so many men, in particular, classically masculine men, back from being open to this kind of thing?
The idea that I cannot be vulnerable. The idea that I don't have a community to be vulnerable with. As men growing up, it was not okay to cry, right? The men these days are a little different, but when
Yeah.
when we were kids growing up, it wasn't okay to cry. It wasn't okay to share how you felt. That's natural with women. Women have a community. When they're young, they have tons of friends. Usually, the older they get, they lose some. But when they're young, they have tons of friends. But the great thing about it is they've always had a community, right? If you need a community to go to find anything as a woman, you can probably find it in a
Mhm.
Facebook group. As a man, if you're trying to find a community, it's extremely difficult. And that's what I realized while I was away in South America is most countries don't have a lot, but they all have family. They all have a tight community. They all help one another. You walk by, they're all saying hello,
Mm.
and that's what's missing here. That's the aloneness, the separateness, is what is holding a lot of men, excuse me, a lot of men back. And
It's killing
so,
them.
yeah,
Yeah.
it is. And when we can figure out a way to truly embrace community, bring men together, and have kind of a forefront for men to go. It's funny because I just met a therapist over the weekend that teaches at Pepperdine,
Mhm.
and she was talking about how 80% of her patients that have come into therapy the last 5 years have been men, which I thought was extremely profound. But two, it just speaks to what's happening right now in the world where men are now seeking help. Before, we may acknowledge we had a problem, we may acknowledge something was wrong, but we wouldn't go out and seek help. And
And
so
before, we all died at 65. So now we got to make
exactly,
it through. You know,
we're trying to, right?
the
Social
bacon
Security's
and the
running out.
beer
We
and
got
the
to do something.
martinis. Yeah, you could have made it to 65 and then you're like, "Ah, I'm going to die anyway. I don't want to talk about it, right? But
We're
we can't
good.
do that
Yeah.
anymore.
No,
Yeah.
exactly. We're living a lot longer, and people. I believe that even though you may not be spiritual or you may not be religious, a lot of people are starting to understand energy, and I think that's the first step to understanding yourself a little bit better.
And essentially, all of us as a society are, I hope, but well, not all of us, frankly, those of us living in this modern privileged piece of society are are finally getting back to what thousands of years of human society originally knew, which was that we need each other and there is more than us, right?
Right.
Have you ever read the Celestine Prophecy?
I have not. No, I'm gonna have to add
You
it to my
should.
reading
I
list.
think it will really, I think you will really enjoy it because it talks a little bit about awakening, but it's described in a way that is very journey-esque, kind of like The Alchemist by Paulo
Mm.
Coelho, those types of books, which I'm sure you know about. And I think it's just very satisfying. So, what is an ego death?
Well, first of all, what is the ego is the question, right? Ego is a version of something, an expectation of something that you think you are, something that you think you need to be. Almost like a vibration of this is who I am, right? An identification to holding on to something in your life. And the death of that ego is when it dissipates, when it no longer is there, because you realize through some sort of spiritual awakening that the ego is the thing that's holding me back. The identification of holding on to something is the thing that is not allowing me to progress, right? Mm-hmm. And usually that's more of a spirit, like I said, a spiritual thing that leads into a higher level of understanding of the world. And when that happens, it shatters your reality because the ego holds on to what I believe my reality is. It's like living in a movie, and that movie completely changes to a different script. And at that time, that death is painful. It could be violent in terms of the body, but it's a dying of your reality to understand, or an awakening to understand that there is something completely different out there, right? Whether it's for you, whether it's in general, but that ego dies and you start to go through this process of awakening, which is the hard part, which is where, in Hinduism or Buddhism is suffering, right? Mm-hmm. You go through this period of suffering because you're trying to grasp onto a reality that doesn't exist. And you have to find out what that next reality is for you. And that's really the psychosis of where most people struggle in life, is that their current reality is either not serving them, or they're holding on to a reality that isn't going to align with the next part or the next version of who it is that they're going to become.
And so they have to be willing to go searching and able to go searching, intellectually curious enough to go searching.
That's
right?
The first step is the search. It's the journey.
When I was reading a little bit about you a couple of days ago, it was making me think, there's this paradigm, there's this template almost of the warrior turned sage, right? And that's not uncommon, right? If you look at history, there is a template of warrior turned sage, which is, you can find it in various different countries. The one that comes to mind for me is there was an emperor in India, Emperor Ashoka. He was one of the most violent, most horrific war machine running kings in the history of India. I mean, killed hundreds of thousands of people. And the story goes that during his lifetime, the cries of the mothers across India went on for so long that eventually they hit his soul, right? And he realized hundreds of thousands of people had died because of the war machine he had created. He'd also amassed the largest empire ever, right? So it was at that point where he had his awakening. But basically the idea was that he finally realized that it was never going to end, that his ego would never be satisfied because there was always more land to conquer. There were always more people to kill. And the story goes that he was looking for something else. And because he finally realized the damage of all of that violence, the warrior turned sage and he found Buddhism. And he sort of transformed the Mauryan Empire from a killing machine, to a society of tolerance. And really that's when Buddhism and tolerance started to kind of expand across India. And it was because so many people died. So now you live in a world that is utterly the opposite of the NFL. You've already said that you think you would have found your way to the work you're doing now, regardless. Right? Or you would have at least found your way towards breathwork. Help me understand how you go from breathwork to transformational love coaching. And what is that?
It's all a process of understanding who I am, right? And I think at a very young age, we all take these steps because we know we're supposed to. And as an adult, we start taking these steps. Once you realize who you are, you start taking these steps because that's what you believe you should be doing, right? It's more of a journey as opposed to a path, right? Where when you're younger, it's a path. I have to go to school. I have to go to college. I have to get a good job. I have to get married, right? And you may get married. You may not. You may get divorced and realize that I was just doing what everybody else was doing. And so for me, I was always a seeker of knowledge. I was always a seeker of growth. That's just been innate in who I am. I always, if I'm a football player, I want to understand every single facet of the game so I can figure out how to get the edge, right? The edge is what's going to make me better. The edge is what's going to make me great. And so after football, I wanted the edge, right? So I got into finance and I was like, well, what's the edge? And, I found out about guys like Tony Robbins, and I realized, working on yourself was more important than working on your job. So then I attended every single Tony Robbins event, and I went through this whole personal development phenomenon. I wanted to do personal development coaching, right? I always had a knack and a need for wanting to help people. I would sit down in my meetings with clients, and instead of going over their business and talking about their business, I'm talking about themselves and their relationships and how to overcome and have confidence in specific things, right? And so I was doing that back in like 2016, 17, and I was like, how can I turn this into a business? And at the time, I didn't really have all the tools that I have today. And fast forward to the pandemic, everybody kind of went online and couldn't leave the house. And so at that time, I was doing business coaching. And business coaching was more of not focusing on the business, but focusing on the founder, focusing on the CEO, focusing on the executive team, because that drives the business, right? If you have chaos and issues across the board as the founder, if you're going through a divorce, your company's going to feel it, right? Yeah. And so I started coaching in that vein, and through this whole time, I'm still going through this spiritual kind of awakening, if you will. And then I started to go to my best friend Curtis started to ask me to open up and speak at his breathwork events. And so I was like, oh, I'd love that. Yeah, let's do it. So I start speaking and opening up and introducing him. And I remember we were doing this event in Orange County for this big finance group. They managed like a couple of $1 trillion worth of assets. And there's about 100 people in the hotel room, in the conference room. And I introduced him, I brought him up, and I'm just, he's taking him through the breath work. And I'm just sitting there watching people have these transformational experiences, like life-changing experiences. I'm watching them come off the yoga mat completely changed. And I'm like, I got to do this. I was like, I'm here, I'm in it. I'm like, why am I not doing it? And a month after that event, he has something called teacher training where he certifies people to teach breath work. And so I called him up a couple of days after the event. I wanted to make sure it wasn't just my ego at the event. Like, I want to do this. I called him up a few days later and I said, hey, I'm coming to teacher training. And he's like, no way. And I'm like, yeah, I'm coming. And it's a 5-day retreat in Utah, St. George, Utah, probably about 30 minutes outside of St. George. And I'm thinking I'm going there to learn breath work. Mm-hmm. I had no idea I was going there to completely transform who I was. Because in order to be able to teach breath work and be able to facilitate breath work, you have to understand one of the most important things that you can ever understand as a person, but particularly as a man. And it's how to hold space for someone to be able to transform. That is more powerful than anything you can learn in life. Because in order to be able to hold space, you have to completely let go of who you are, and you have to completely surrender to the moment and allow them to move through whatever energy they need to move through. And I'm going through this process, and we're jumping in, and I know you got questions. I'll stop.
No, I just want to say that is a really powerful and clear explanation of why so many relationships don't work, because of that lack of realization of what it means to hold space. That's just a beautiful explanation. Go on.
Thank you. You're absolutely right, and I'll jump back into that. And so it's a 5-day event, and I'm doing things that I would never do, right? I hate cold water. We had to get in this cold plunge in this river. It was freezing. I hate it. I hate cold water. But every day I'm breaking through a different barrier of who I thought I was, and an identification of what I thought my life was going to be, to where at the end, I realized that I didn't go there to teach breathwork. I went there to release the old version of myself. And in the process, I learned how to teach breathwork, right? And how I got into relationship coaching is we go through this exercise where we hike into this deep mountain, this deep cave, if you will. And we all have headlamps on, and we're hiking, helmets and headlamps, and we're hiking all the way to the bottom. And we get to the bottom, and we turn off all of our lights. And I've done this a few times because I've also spoken at his events. And it's each event is probably about 90% to 95% female and 5% male, right? So there's always 25 women and like 2 guys, right? And when we go to this cave, you know, we turn our lights off. It's pitch black dark. Nobody knows who anybody is. And Curtis says, you know, you never are free until you can let go of your deepest, darkest secret. And people just start sharing. Gives them the ground to share. And no one says their name. No one knows who it is. And people just start sharing. And again, it's all women. And out of the things that are shared, about 90% of the things that are shared are some sort of issue that women have had with men, either as a child, molestation, or something along those sorts, or a breakup, or a father not being there. And you quickly see how the masculine completely controls this entire world. And when I say controls, it is the inability to control the masculine and balance that out with the feminine, the yin and the yang. And if you can heal men, you will see that there's a completely different shift that's going to happen with women and the rest of the world, because women are the ones who are raising men. Right. And so I was like, well, let me take this approach backwards. Let me focus on women first to help women understand and awaken and deal with this trauma, deal with the hurt that's been done by men, while at the same time building the ammunition to be able to go back and take it to men to understand this is what you have to do if you want to be the man that is going to be with a woman like this. Because the biggest problem that I'm seeing with relationships right now is women can't find a man because the man can't hold the space for the feminine to thrive. It just doesn't work right now, because the spirituality is coming in through the feminine. It's creating this independence. And what you're going to see is women are going to continue to become independent, which is beautiful. But if the masculine doesn't understand that he is going to have to create that space and that safety net for them to be able to flourish, it's not going to happen. It's impossible to work. And so we're at this cataclysm in the world where it's a beautiful place, because this is the first time in history where women are having the power again. The power is starting to even out. We're not there yet. It's coming.
But we're supposed to rise together, and we're losing each other.
We're I wouldn't say losing. We're rebalancing.
But that's what I'm saying. We're not balancing at the same rate. This is why I think you're going to love the Celestine prophecy. There's so much in what you said that I want to touch on. First of all, cold plunges and walks into the deep, dark cave sound very unpleasant. So I would not be on that retreat because that sounds unpleasant.
You're
And I'm a
coming one
cranky
day.
middle-aged lady who
You're
likes
coming.
comfort.
You're up
I'm
next.
not, I'm not, no, I'm not going anywhere cold, and I'm not going anywhere dark. I've been to all the cold, dark places. I am a middle-aged lady who does not put herself into discomfort anymore. But what you bring up is really, really necessary. There's someone else I talked to on the podcast, Dr. Amanda Hansen. She has been, she's a psychologist. She's known as the midlife muse, and she has a big book coming out around the patriarchy. There are people who will look at her and criticize her and say that she is too aggressive or too feminist. But I think what they're missing is she's getting at the same problem from a different direction. And what she's saying is, women need to heal themselves, because if women refuse to accept less, the men around them will rise to the occasion, or those who cannot will fall away. So we talked a little bit about what's the future of modern marriage in a world where so many women are focused on healing and so many men don't have the tools that they need to get where they need to go. What I love about what you're saying is that you recognize there is a necessary balance between the masculine and feminine. Men are supposed to be leaders. There is something to that. And it's been twisted and bastardized in a way that's created an adversarial relationship between the masculine and the feminine, because the feminine has become weak, which it wasn't meant to be, and because the masculine has become toxic, which it wasn't meant to be. If you do this work with the women, and let's say you get to the right place with the majority of the women you want to work with, what, I think I understand what you're doing with the women.
Sure.
What is your approach with the men?
My first step with men, and this is always where I go, is they have to open their hearts. The rigidity in how men function emotionally is the key driver as to why relationships are so difficult.
But that's
Because
a
if a
phrase. How do you do it? How do you get them to open their hearts?
yeah,
Bunch of
I
ayahuasca in the woods, in the cave. Is it in the cave?
we could that's a deep dive. Not everyone's ready for that. They may not come back after that one.
Mushroom.
But I try to stay away from psychedelics because first of all, you want to stay in your frequency. Anything that is taking you and bringing you to a higher level of consciousness. This is why psychedelics are so beautiful, but also they can be detrimental because I'm taking you out of your natural comfort zone in terms of your level of vibration, and I'm bringing you to a much higher state of awareness. And if you've never been there, when you come back, your brain almost can't fabricate what happened. And so that's what kind of jolts you and shocks you into the spiritual awakening and going down the road of asking questions. And that's why it's so painful. And a lot of people keep going back to doing it over and over and over. Right. I met a guy who's done ayahuasca over 100 times.
Oh,
And you can see that there's a level that is not there anymore. That
yeah.
should be there, like because we're still all human. We're here to live a human experience,
Right. And
and
it's been
that
around for so long. People were doing it carefully in the
correct.
tribes and in the indigenous situation. 100 times, that guy's not okay.
Yeah, exactly. But in terms of how I highly recommend anybody do this is to start with breath work. That's the number one way you can open your heart. There's no faster way in 30 minutes to change. It's almost like 20 years of therapy in 30 minutes,
Why do you think
which
people
is
are so
mind blowing
resistant to breath
because
work?
it's it's new. It's a novelty that is being presented to the world that is not widely recognized. Yoga 10 years ago was not like I didn't start doing yoga until I was about almost in my third year in the NFL after I'd gone through two injuries, growing tear and a pec tear, that I started to embrace yoga. And it was because of that. But it wasn't the spiritual component, right? Yoga has, over the last 10 years, yoga has exploded. It's a yoga studio everywhere in the world.
Right.
What you're going to see is the same thing happening with breath work over the next, call it 6 years. There's going to be an explosion, which you'll see across the board. And you're already kind of seeing it if you're paying attention to it.
So much of it is about going inward, right? And there are things like this that are happening all over the world. If you've ever done Vipassana meditation, things like that, they've used these things in prisons because those are the populations that need it. If you could design a course for folks starting out in the NFL, what would it look like?
Design a course.
Think about the age. This is a
Yeah.
bunch of
Gosh.
18 to 22-year-old run directly at the wall kids in men's bodies. I mean,
Yeah.
not to be obnoxious
We,
or anything, right?
I, listen, I've been there. I know. I get it. I wouldn't do anything but breath work. I would start there, and that would be the first step. And from there, we would, I like group things. I like communities. I'd really just want to build a community and safety for people to be able to meet, a couple times a month and talk about the things that we don't normally get to talk about. Talk about our relationship problems, not feeling confident, being jealous. Where is that coming from? Why are we possessive? Controlling our chi, our prana, our sexual energy, our life force, right? That's a big problem with athletes because they have so much of it, right? Athletes have more life force than probably, I'd say 90% of men in the world because they're constantly training, they're constantly hitting people. That level of aggression, and then the biology behind it pushes that life force through you, and so it's a lot of energy to manage. And if you don't know how to properly manage that energy, you start taking it and putting it into places that may not be great for you because you're trying to deal with specific situations, right? You're either numbing yourself or you're reacting. There's one of the two,
Right.
right? You're
Numbing
either
or reacting is
repressing, you're
pretty
either
much the
repressing
difference.
something or you're reacting.
It's a
right?
playbook of toxic masculinity. It's numbing and reacting. And you make the point about life force. Do you think that NFL players, professional athletes would, on some level, fear things like this because of the idea that going into the soft parts of yourself would mute that life force?
I don't think it's fear. I just think it's taboo right now. I think
Mm.
it's unnatural. It's not really heard of. I know there's one other guy in the NFL who is teaching breath work and doing in kind of along the lines of what I'm talking about, but it's not to the level it's to what we're doing, right? To where you're laying on a yoga mat and you're diving deep. This is deep diaphragmatic breathing. This isn't, we're not doing box breathing. You're gonna sweat some things out. You're gonna sweat some past lives out. You're gonna on this yoga mat. You're gonna have something's gonna happen,
It's going to be a
and
messy mat. Yeah.
it's a messy mat, and you just see that not everyone's ready for this. Even if I go into corporate or I've tried to get my family to do it. It took my parents probably 6 months after inviting them to events. My brother still hasn't done it. My sister hasn't done it. So
Really?
yeah, I've
Wow.
invited them to events, but it takes the right time, and that's the hardest thing is getting someone on this yoga mat because once
Can't you
they're
just tell
there.
them you're not coming to Christmas if they don't do it? Can't you just? I mean, that's not fair. They're your family. This is a
I
life's
know.
calling for you.
I know. I want to drag him, but the that's the old me. The old me would have just grabbed him and threw him on the mat and said, "Breathe," But
Threw him on the mat and said, "Breathe." Now we got some insight into the way that you teach breath work, which sounds a little bit, a little bit toxically masculine. What's the story that you think men need to stop telling themselves?
I, I I try not to speak in generalities. It's tough because there's so many different men. I think the biggest
Toxic
story,
men. Men with toxic masculinity.
toxic.
Men who are really driven more than 50% by their fear.
Most people are driven by fear, but if it was
That's
toxic
depressing.
masculinity,
Yeah.
the story you have to stop telling yourself is that your relationship doesn't matter because men believe that, well, if I have work or if I'm making money or if I have things, even though this relationship doesn't work, I'm still good, right? I'm gonna be good because I got money, you know I'm whether I got money or not, girls are still gonna like me. I'll find somebody else, right?
Mhm.
And that story right there is creating the narrative for the next relationship. You showing up not as you showing up based on what you have or what you do. And that's the biggest. I feel like that's across the board for men. That's that's the old paradigm. The old paradigm is I can be a provider.
Mhm.
These next 50 years, women don't need men to be providers because women are going to be making more money than men. They're already doing it, right?
Yeah, we
Fifty
already are.
percent of 50% of women by 2030 around the world are going to be making more money than men. That fact is in this book called Factfulness, so you can fact check that.
Well,
It's
I know it just from, being a woman on the planet. Yeah.
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 So it's happening, and that's not what women need going forward. That's the old narrative, the provider. The new narrative is you need to be the provider of essence, of pure energy, of love. You need to provide that. And if you can't, you're not going to be in a relationship because as much as women need men, they're completely fine being by themselves. They'd rather be without a man and be traveling with their girls and children and all this good stuff than be with a man that cannot give them the energy that they need to be able to be in a happy relationship and a fulfilled relationship.
We both seem to have had very strong fathers. And I have the best dad. But it gets louder and louder the older that I get, and the way that I see everyone coping with things or not coping with things or coping badly with things. Because it's not as if I give myself credit for my coping mechanisms, right? But as we're getting older, so many of my friends have parents who are getting older and dying. There's this phrase that stuck in my head that says, "We're all children until our fathers die." I think it's very true. But as I see friends losing their fathers, the fathers are in many cases leaving a lot of money behind, so they're still providing.
Mm.
But the loss is so tremendously intense because the real thing that a father provides is that I've got you. No matter what you do, right? You can fall apart, you can mess up, I can disagree with all your choices. I'm going to say I disapprove. And also, here's a blanket, take a nap, right? I mean, it's just a thing. It's just what a father is, or at least what a good father is.
Yeah.
And so when you describe what men need to provide for women, it's almost this fatherly level of I'm here. I am holding this energetic space for you. And you that's something you can hold on to.
Yeah.
It's
It's
never
funny
it's never not
because
there.
I just posted something on Instagram not too long ago saying that when you get with a woman, when you are in a relationship with a woman, you aren't just becoming the boyfriend or the husband. You're becoming parts of her father, right? That's not there, or you're taking on parts of who her father was,
Yeah,
because that's why she loves you,
right.
because you resemble all the parts of a man that she loves, and the first love for any woman is her father.
Yeah, the first safety. I think that people have trouble with the concept that we seek out our father in our partnerships.
Yeah.
And it makes sense because it sounds weird and Oedipal, right? But we do seek out that safety. If we have a safe father, we
If you have a
seek that
safe
out
father,
in our
correct.
relationships.
But you also seek out the parts of the father that may not be great. So if you and I think that, I think that whether it's good or bad, it's all based on perception. But we all know what a great upbringing looks like, and we know what, not one that probably isn't the best looks like. And for those women who are going through or have gone through those sort of struggles, you see them seeking that out at a very young age in men until they learn.
Mhm.
Either they learn quickly or they take it into their 30s. And that's usually where you're seeing, like, most women that I've worked with and that I've seen start awakening around 28 to 9, and then right around 32 it just explodes for whatever reason. Could be a Saturn return. It's usually when Saturn returns. It takes 32 years for the Saturn to go around the Earth, so that could be it. But it's usually around that age for whatever reason right now, and that's changing. I think for the more information that's out there, the more awake that we become. It allows children to move into that process a little bit faster. But that's what I'm seeing right now.
My vote is for you to launch an unconditional self-love course for the NFL, and that it's part of basic training. It's part of they get drafted and they have to spend a week down in a cave with you, just sweating it all out. And
Just
also, I would like to film that. I would like to film it. I would like to watch it. I would like to come with my popcorn. I'm not going to tell anybody. We're not going to put it on the podcast, but can I just come and
you're
can I just
you're
watch?
you're in. It's your idea. You're coming.
Thank you for being on the podcast.
Oh, thank you for having me. This was delightful.